long journey, I must say. I was in Delhi yesterday, I flew back to Chennai last night, left at 5:30 this morning, and I'm headed back in about 10 minutes when I finish speaking. But I thought it was very important to be here, partly because of my respect and long association with the Chancellor of the University. They do such tremendous work, and as our Chief Minister said, they can certainly serve as the example or the role model of the quality of education in Tamil Nadu. I won't repeat the statistics, but it is clearly the preeminent university at a national level that we have here, a private university. It's rare to find an institution of such excellence and scale. It's very easy to maintain excellence when you have a few hundred or a few thousand students. And it's much, much harder to scale it to, in this case, 87,000 students, 40,000 on this campus alone. So first I must congratulate them and thank them for hosting this conference. I also think that it's very apt that this society, which is so important to our progress as a society, I mean the sociological society, but as a community, as a country, as a democracy, is holding its annual conference here, the 48th conference. It's been in existence as a society for now 70 odd years, which I think is heartening to me. And I particularly like the theme of this conference, which is the crises of the 21st century and the way forward. Since it's a 3-day conference and there's many academics here, I want to just throw out a few thoughts that I had as I was coming down this morning about the kinds of crises, the root cause of these crises, or at least the causes, and what I see as some of the way forward. But if I start listing the crises, at least from the ones that are most intractable and most, deeply problematic, I would start first, especially for those of you who live in Tamil Nadu or have relatives in places like Chennai or Thyagarajan. Climate change, global warming, the changes in nature and our inability to predict or control these changes and their consequences, and in some sense the shape-shifting of viral genetics and coming to the nature of pandemics. I think by far the last decade or two have taught us that these are the most profound problems and crises we face today. At a slightly lower complexity, because they're man-made and man-controllable to some extent, the notion of armed conflict, especially those with civilian casualties like you're seeing in Ukraine and Gaza, are against the nature of humanity and the progress of humankind when innocent civilians are being killed in armed conflict in this scale. I would say at the next level, going down into maybe the causality, the decaying or the crumbling of institutions. And I think the role of institutions like the United Nations, which once had significant heft and impact, and when they said something, it meant something. And the ability, or the lack of ability, I should say, of the UN to do anything really substantive, either in the Ukraine or in Gaza, is indicative, I think, of a global decay. This is not just happening for multinational or international institutions, but also within countries, the nature of government, the role of democracy, the independence of institutions, all of these are decaying at a rapid rate. I would even extend that to the role of regulatory bodies and institutions like the press, which have become largely bought or sold, and the true independence doesn't seem to exist anymore. And I think even more profound than that is the fact that we have this huge amount of unemployment, underemployment, a lot of poverty, and in some sense a reversal of the decades of progress that we had been seeing, let's say from the Second World War through the 90s, through even the 2000 era, where there was a steady improvement in the alleviation of poverty, in the upliftment of the quality of life, in the reduction of number of people that had less than full rights. All of those seem to be unraveling in the last 15, 20 years of this century. What are some of the causes? I was just minded that we live in an era of hyper-globalization. Though those of us who are bit students of history will realize this is not the first era of globalization. Certainly the Roman Empire, certainly the days of colonial rule, there was a lot more integrated global economies and then they separated again. But this age of globalization is unique in the sense that it's hyper-globalization through the integration not just of economies, of trade, of transport, but also of labor, also of capital markets, also of services delivered through the wires, and of global commerce through the internet. This hyper-globalization has created in many ways one universal marketplace, electronically in terms of the internet, but also in terms of manufactured goods. Effectively, the supply chains are integrated all over the world. And what it has led to on the plus side is unprecedented wealth creation. If you go back and look mathematically, the notion of a country like China taking 1,300,000,000 people or so from, as the Chancellor said, $200 to $12,000 in less than 30 or 40 years is unprecedented. Nowhere in history has that much wealth been created because of the sheer scale of the people who have been uplifted. But what it has also led to is extreme disparity. Those of you who are students of macroeconomics or global trade will know that almost always deregulation, the lifting of barriers, internationalization will lead to increased wealth creation and increased aggregate GDP growth rates and international wealth creation. It will almost always also lead to increased disparity. Unless you have conscious government programs and very tailored and nuanced steps intended to prevent that from happening, this rapid increase in wealth will also result in rapid increases in disparity. It's an automatic, it happens in parallel. In fact, such increases will exacerbate the otherwise somewhat hidden weaknesses in the nature of democracy. And what are those? Primarily because it is very hard in a democracy, even the best democracies of the world, to separate money and politics. So if you have unprecedented wealth creation, that wealth will lead to a further subversion of the natural weakness of democracy through the application of wealth in one-sided ways that removes the notion of a level playing field, that creates arbitrary barriers to entry, that protects the strongest and leaves the weakest where they are. This is even further compounded by the fact that we now live in an era of online lives where people's profiles can be built based on what they like, what they see, and through that, with the natural reduction of attention spans that is happening as a glut of online information increases, then you will end up with greater polarization because people will be fed more and more of the same content that reinforces their limited understanding of something and excludes them from being fully informed and seeing a diversity of views. The consequence of all this, I think, is a deterioration in the nature of politics and a clear deterioration in the nature of political leadership. If you look at the country or you look at the world today, you have people who are very good at polarization, very good at winning elections, very good at divisive mathematical calculus, but there's almost a dearth of statesmanship. Think around the world today. Are there global leaders who have the capacity to speak with moral authority against something that is profoundly, fundamentally against human nature or human values, like the murder of innocent civilians? And there's very few people who are either willing or able to do that. And when they are willing to do that, they have actually diminished their own status by doing very kind of divisive politics focused on the lowest common denominator in their own countries. So the more internal politics gets degraded and debased to this kind of polarization and kind of vote calculus, the 30%, 35%, 40% that is needed to win an election, the more the global community suffers because there are only local chieftains and everybody's worried about their home ground, their home turf, and they're not able to really play at a global level. And we have this hugely hyper-integrated global economy with very little global thought leadership or moral leadership or statesmanship. So it's a pretty bleak picture, actually, if you ask me. But is there a way forward? And I think as I was coming down, I was thinking about 7 or 8 things which I think could make a profound difference. And I think the first, if you look around the country and certainly look around the world, is to profoundly improve the quality and access to education. So if you look, not only is it about who has access to education, it's about how much education they have access to. If you look at country to country, state to state, city to village, any of these differences, you find that where education is emphasized, particularly elementary education, and where it is universal, boys and girls get the same access, all communities get access, compulsory education is either enforced or incentivized through things like free breakfast, free lunch. These are the areas where you actually start creating the capital, the human capital, that is going to be the pool from which you're going to develop tomorrow's workers, tomorrow's leaders, tomorrow's statesmen who are better than today's. The good news is I think many places of the world are realizing that. I was on a tour of 6 or 7 universities in the US last month. I took my younger son, who's an 11th class student, and we stopped at very prestigious universities, Chicago, Brown, MIT, Harvard, Yale, Columbia. And in Chicago, I was very surprised to learn that that's where the birth of the field of sociology happened, otherwise seen as a very strong technical school in things like biology or biological sciences or economics. The notion of the degree of sociology, of the field of sociology, actually was first born at the University of Chicago, funded by Rockefeller's money back in the day. And at my old school at MIT, they are so focused now that the students should learn adequate subjects in humanities. So they require that whatever specialization you're doing in one of the best technological universities in the world, you have to be taking at least 4 or 5 core courses in the humanities early in your education. So I think the nature of education, the universality of access, and the quality of the study to include things like humanities rather than just the skill that will get you employed, I think will create better citizenry, and that might be the single biggest hope for creating a better tomorrow and working our way through these crises. The second, I think, is a focus on reducing inequality to the extent possible. Now, in any capitalist model, it's very difficult to eliminate inequality. But if you look around the world, those societies that have succeeded to some extent in keeping inequality to a lower level, keeping the Gini coefficient lower, tend to have better outcomes. I can talk about that internationally, but I can also talk about that domestically. If you look at a state like Tamil Nadu, one of the reasons we do relatively well and have relatively high per capita consumption, even as a function of the total economy, compared to other advanced states like Maharashtra or Gujarat, Tamil Nadu is a very high per capita consumption equation because we have lower Gini coefficient, we have greater spread of the wealth. As scientists and as administrators, I think the third thing we can do is collect a lot more data and analyze it. And if we are smart, we pre-program in certain limits or certain actions based on the data. So for example, in the old days, we were not collecting nearly enough data because we didn't have collection efficiency and we didn't have infinite storage like we do today. But if we can collect the data and analyze it, we actually understand what is happening. It's very hard to fight inequality if I don't know how much inequality there is. And not a lot of the economy is visible to us. In Tamil Nadu, we do a lot of that. I think as a country, as the world, we need to do a lot more. We have arrangements with people like MIDS, with JPAL, We do surveys beyond the NSSO. We look at extent of housing access, extent of penetration of welfare programs, and this data will help us. And if we set automatic limits or automatic actions, so when I was in finance, for example, after 30 years of not actually indexing the government's revenues to inflation, we started doing that. Think about it. Most governments in India today, all our expenses are automatically or statutorily indexed to inflation. The DA increases in the payrolls and pensions, or the cost of running programs or subsidies is automatically indexed to inflation because that's the world we operate in. But most of our income is fixed. We have no indexation to inflation. Many advanced economies figured out how to solve this problem years or decades ago. Nobody in India had done it. In Tamil Nadu, under my chief minister, when I was in finance for the first time, we started indexing some revenues to inflation so that the state's revenues keep up with its expenditure, which is automatically inflation indexed. And if we do that, we can keep the inequality down by spending these revenues rather than going into a debt trap. The fourth thing I would say is institutions like universities, like research labs, like think tanks, to take these data points and do analysis and suggest adaptations and solutions to how we can maintain a more equitable and a more just and humane society. The fifth thing I would say is what all advanced economies have shown us, which is to devolve power to the local government so you can have local self-governance, that is from the center to the state to the local bodies, because the odds of any elected official being held accountable by the voters substantially increases when the ratio is 5 or 10,000 is to 1. If you're a local body councillor in a village, it's probably 1,000 is to 1 in Tamil Nadu. In a city, it's probably 8,000 or 10,000 is to 1. By the time you come to an MLA, it's about 2.5, 3 lakh is to 1 in Tamil Nadu, probably 4 lakh is to 1 in UP. And by the time you come to an MP, it's probably 15 or 20 lakh, 25 lakh is to 1. The odds that that MP can be held accountable by those voters is exactly 0. So you're not fostering democracy at all. You're fostering an authoritarian shift of power towards a party leadership, towards a brand, towards a place where money can create a jet stream where any candidate can be elected, and you're no longer representing the people's concerns. So the more you have the scale of Singapore, Australia, Canada, where 30,000 people, 40,000 people have an elected representative, the more likely those elected representatives actually are held accountable and therefore behave in a way that they will be able to answer the electorate. We don't have anywhere near that ratio. The next thing I would say is to create level playing fields and transparent and efficient markets so that it is not a rigged insider game, and because it's perceived to be a rigged insider game, many people choose not to participate, and you have highly inefficient outcomes where a few grab everything. The Chancellor gave many of the statistics that I myself was going to talk about, which is the extent of concentration of wealth, grossly exaggerated in the hands of a few, which means clearly that we don't have level playing fields and the markets are not transparent or efficient. If you look around the world today, those places that have managed to maintain a middle class, a middle tier of enterprises, MSME enterprises, a middle level of industries or institutions or universities, rather than only a few big ones. Of course, we all need some big ones, but if you have only 3 or 4 big ones, nothing else in the middle, medium, small, and then you only have like small family businesses, you have a highly inefficient market structure. You take places like Germany, where there's a vibrant industrial economy, they have a huge MSME base that actually has world-class skills of manufacturing, of robotics, of innovation, in companies that employ 300 people, 500 people, that do 200 million a year in business, 50 million a year in business. This middle tier is crucial. And if you look again, relatively speaking in Tamil Nadu, one of the great advantages we have is that we have many, many more small and medium enterprises, micro enterprises. They create jobs at a much more rapid scale. It costs about 1.5 lakh rupees of capital to create a job in MSME sector, and it costs about 30 lakhs of capital to create one job in heavy manufacturing, at least. These days that ratio is more like 1 crore or 1.5 crores because of the automation. Now there will be second order, third order OEM and indirect employment benefits, but still the ratio is not in the same frame, 1.5 lakh to 1.5 crore. You'd have to create 100 times the secondary and tertiary jobs to be as employment efficient as the MSME sector. If we allow this kind of concentration to go on, and this slide to everybody only watches their own corner, their own pocketbook, and you allow this exaggeration and concentration, what you're going to find is that the benefit of the commons gets eroded all the time. And the rights of the commons and the future of the commons are at stake. And I think the clearest example of that is how little progress we're able to make on reducing the impact of greenhouse gases, trying to combat climate change, and trying to preserve the environment, which ought to be everybody's priority. It ought to be the first common good for all citizens of all countries, rich and poor, around the world, ought to be trying to keep environmental sustainability. And yet we have COP after COP after COP, and we don't really seem to be making progress. The ability to come to focus on the common good seems to be lost in parochial concerns, whether that's individual industrial parochial concerns or whether that is, country by country, fossil fuel country compared to green energy country. The battle is not even. So these are some of the thoughts I had about the crises, the causes, and what could be potentially solutions. But I think such conferences are vital. I'm very happy that all of you are here today in Tamil Nadu, in Vellore, at VIT. I hope the next 2-3 days will be very fruitful and productive for you individually, for all of us collectively as society. I think the themes are increasingly relevant and very well selected. Number one, increasing social inequalities and conflict and violence. What is the way forward? Number two, which I would have actually put at number one, environment and health concerns, issues and prospects. Number three, challenges and crises in sustaining society. And I think Tamil Nadu, though we're far from perfect, broadly speaking, I think we are well ahead of the national average and can actually be an example in many ways for the rest of the country. And then, of course, the future, which is about space exploration, earthly challenges, so forth. So I thank you once again for inviting me. I wish you all a productive and fun conference filled with friendship, camaraderie, the exchange of ideas. We're very happy to have you here. We hope you'll develop interesting insights and future plans that will help all of us in society. You're doing very important work. Please continue to do so. Thank you.